And this proof starts out by noticing that we have moral convictions. Pretty obvious. We all have moral convictions. Let's take one that we all share, I assume. We all know that it's wrong to torture children for pleasure. But here's the question, ready? Here is the question. Where do we get that knowledge from? Where do we get our moral convictions from? There's a couple possible answers. Someone could say, well, we get our moral knowledge by looking out at the natural world, by examining the facts of life. But that doesn't work because the natural world, the facts of life show us what is the case, where our moral convictions are about what ought to be the case, and there's a clear dissymmetry there. Those two don't line up. The facts of life, the natural world, shows us that it is the case that some people torture children for pleasure. Whereas our moral convictions tell us that it ought not to be the case that some people torture children for pleasure. So they don't line up. You can't get your moral convictions by looking out at the natural world because the natural world doesn't show you a moral picture. So someone might say, well, let's try this. Maybe we get our moral convictions from within ourselves. Maybe our moral convictions are expressions of our own desires, choices, preferences, instincts. But that doesn't work either, for a couple of reasons. One is, you notice we're always very careful to show that the truth of our moral convictions is independent of our own personal situation. If I see someone torturing a child, I say, stop. He might say, why? Don't you like it? Don't you choose to live this way? I say, well, of course I don't like it, don't choose to live that way, but that's not the point. There's lots of things I don't like, don't choose to do. I don't like or choose to eat peanut butter and mustard sandwiches. But I wouldn't tell someone to stop. I wouldn't say, don't eat peanut butter and mustard sandwiches, it's wrong. You see, I'm not telling you to stop torturing children because I have a problem with it, but because it's sick and it's wrong and you mustn't do it. Also notice this. When our desires, preferences, choices, instincts are frustrated, what do we feel? We feel disappointment. Whereas, when our moral convictions are frustrated, what do we feel? We feel moral indignation and outrage. And those two are not the same. I may apply for a job and get turned down for it. And I may be disappointed. But I don't necessarily feel outraged. Maybe that was the right decision. Maybe I just wasn't a good fit for the job. Or I may go looking for cookies in the cupboard, find there aren't any. I'm disappointed, but I don't become indignant. Nothing evil happened. Just no cookies. Bummer. Whereas when my moral convictions are frustrated, I feel indignation. I feel that something wrong, something evil has happened. You see, so they can't be the same because the experiences that we have when each one is frustrated are vastly different. So someone might say, well, our moral convictions are determined by the larger culture as a whole, right? Society at large, the given authority figures in any given age, any given setting, that's what determines our sense of right and wrong. That obviously doesn't work either for two reasons. One is, if that were the case, we could never meaningfully talk about social progress, right? We could never say that we've become more ethical, say, in our treatment of women, in our treatment of minorities. Because to be able to say that presupposes that you can take two cultures side by side and compare them against some other standard and say, yeah, this culture is doing better than that one on this issue. And we obviously say that, which shows that the culture can't be its own standard. There must be some other standard that we can compare cultures against. Also notice this, if the culture was what determined our sense of right and wrong, then the very idea of social reform would be a contradiction in terms. Because social reform happens when an individual or a small group of people stand up for what is right against the culture at large, against the general social ethos. But if the general societal ethos was what determined what was right, you could never stand up for what is right against it. But that's precisely what happens. We applaud those people who are brave enough to stand up for what is right, even against the mob, even against the large group, which shows that the large group isn't what determines what's right. That rules out a lot of options, right? We've ruled out, as a source of our moral convictions, we have ruled out the natural world, we have ruled out ourselves, and we have ruled out other people. What's left? Well, some source that goes beyond, that transcends ourselves, that transcends other people, and that transcends the natural world, and this transcendent moral source, this transcendent source of our sense of right and wrong, we call God. The final proof is a proof from logic, and this one starts out by noticing that being is that which is, and non-being is that which is not. So being is what exists, what is real. Non-being is what does not exist and is not real. So I am a being, you're all a being, the podium is a being. Unicorns are non-being because they don't exist. So here's the important point to get. Non-being does not exist by definition. There is no non-being. So far so good, but now go to step 2, and you will see that therefore, being must be infinite. Because if being came to an end, if being had a limit, then it would be natural to say, well, what's after that? What's on the other side of that limit? And then you only have two options. We can say, well, after that, on the other side of that limit is more being. But then, of course, it's not really a limit, right? Because being doesn't really come to an end. Being continues on, uninterrupted. Or you could say, well, after that, on the other side of that limit, there's non-being. Ooh, you said non-being. There is non-being. You can't say that, right? To say there is non-being, to say that non-being exists on the other side of that limit in any way, in any respect, that's to contradict yourself. Because you're saying that that which does not exist, exists, and you don't want to contradict yourself at a reason test. So, the conclusion must be that being is infinite. But if being is infinite, then being is also perfect, because imperfection comes from missing something. For instance, if you get a 99% score on a test, that's a good score. But it's imperfect. Why? Because you're missing that 1% of the right answer. But if you're infinite, you can't be missing anything, so you can't have any imperfection, so you have to be perfect. Therefore, this infinite being is perfect, and this infinite perfect being we call God. And by the way, since you can't add to infinity, whatever Buzz Lightyear may tell you, our being, our existence, is no addition to the infinite perfect existence of God. Rather, our existence is a limited, finite share in the perfect infinite being of God. So this infinite perfect being, who allows us to be by allowing us to share in a limited way in his being, in a finite imperfect way in his infinite perfect being, we call God. So that's a pretty good start, I'd say. We've proven that there has to be a necessarily existing source of all the existence that we see around us. We've shown that there has to be a transcendent, a source that transcends the world, ourselves, and other human beings, a source of morality, of our moral convictions. Right, that's what I mean by morality, our moral convictions. And also that there has to be an infinite, perfect being who allows us to be by sharing in his being. So notice this. The first proof shows that if God doesn't exist, if God doesn't exist, things are inherently inexplicable. But reason could never help us explain what's inherently inexplicable. The second proof shows that our sense of good and bad, our sense of value, depends on God's existence. And we could never assign value to reason. We could never say that reason was good if we didn't have a sense of value or good at all. And finally, the last proof shows that if God doesn't exist, things break down into absurdity, into contradictions, into senselessness. And if things are senseless, then reason can't help us make sense of things. The point is that reason depends on God for the operation, for its operations, to fulfill its functions. Reason depends on God to do what it does. At a Reason Fest, the one we should really be celebrating is the one who makes it all possible. That is God. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Dan Barker will now have his opening statement for 15 minutes. As a quick note, if you could please keep the aisles cleared in case of any emergencies. Thank you.
So this Catholic priest takes a rabbi to a boxing match. And one of the boxers makes the sign of the cross, and the rabbi turns to the priest and said, "What does that mean?" And the priest said, "Not a damn thing if you can't fight." Yesterday was the National Day of Prayer, and of course we all know that nothing fails like prayer. We all know that. How many prayers have been said forever, and they have not been able to keep praying for God's blessing, and nothing changes. Nothing. If there were a God, you would think there'd be some evidence for that. Thank you, John-Mark. Very eloquent. Nice to meet you. Thank you, Conrad. Thank you, Soma and St. Thomas More Society. And thank all of you for coming.